Welcome back to this course on English language and literature. As you are aware, we come to you with a series of lectures, in fact 4 modules comprising 40 lectures in total on English language and literature, and you have already seen the scope of all the scope of this course, and we are in module 2 of this course. And as you are well aware, module 2 is devoted to an exploration of the history of English language, and these courses are being brought to you by NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, the courses are by faculty mainly from the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. Let me remind you once again that the target audience of this course comprises students in, now do a quick recap of Old English, which was our topic of discussion in the last lecture. Well, you would remember that whenever we talk about the history of the English language, okay, we need to refer to 3 marauding tribes, okay, from Europe: the Jutes, the Saxons and the Angles. And the Jutes are supposed to have come to England from Jutland, Saxons from Holstein and Angles from Schleswig. In fact, here inside in this just a moment please. Well, you will find here that the word English had other variations. For instance, you can see that it comes from the word Angles, from the tribe of the Angles, and we have these names. For instance, England was initially called England, okay, and English had this particular spelling, right. So, the old English replaces, as we saw in the last lecture, replaces the largely Celtic language, okay, and that was there in Britain. And we also know that after the settle, once the Jutes, the Angles and the Saxons settled in Britain, the Celtic language moved really to places in Cornwall, in Wales, okay, and parts of Scotland, right. So, Old English is the English that came about after the use of the language that came along with the Jutes, Saxons and the Angles, and we call this period is also known as the Anglo-Saxon period. Then we found that some of the characteristics of Old English are as follows: that definitely the pronunciation of Old English words differs hugely, if we may use a word, from that of their modern equivalents. You only need to go to Google Images, you can look for the Old English script, and you can look at some of the manuscripts, okay, from Google Images, and for copyright reasons I have not brought them here, those here, but you can have a look at some of the recordings, okay, the readings of from the old English scripts that are there on YouTube, for instance, and you can then have an idea of how different the pronunciation is, how different the vocabulary, the words are from the kind of English that we use today. Okay. Then there is also a difference in grammar. Of course, Old English is called synthetic, while modern English is an analytical language, and this is what analytic language. Sorry, this is what we are going to look at in our lecture on modern English later on. For grammar also, there was a distinction of number, singular and plural, and case, and grammatical gender was not dependent upon considerations of sex. For example, Mona, moon is masculine, sun is feminine, Magdan, girl, wife and child are a neuter, while wife, man, woman is masculine because the second element of the compound is masculine. So, we saw in the last lecture how these, how Old English differs tremendously from modern English. There was also the twofold declension, if you remember, of the adjective, where strong declension is used with nouns when not accompanied by a definite article, and weak declension used when the noun is preceded by an article. Okay. Next, we also look briefly at Old English literature and following A.C. Baugh, okay, who said that the literature of the Anglo-Saxons is fortunately one of the richest and most significant of any preserved among the early Teutons. Okay. One of the most well known texts is of course Beowulf, which is a folk epic, and many of you have at least heard of the name Beowulf, the Dior poem, and the Seafarer. Okay. So, these are some of the examples. We are not going into the literature part, okay, of Old English. This module being devoted only to language. Okay. When we talk about literature, most in our module on literature and the various ages of literature, for instance, the age of Chaucer, beginning with I think the age of Chaucer, we would have occasion to look through Professor Krishna Borra more into detail, okay, where she also begins by talking about Beowulf, right. So, then also, so we found that there were war poems and and tragedies like The Wanderer and translations under the famous king Alfred in that period. So, well, let us now talk about Middle English, and let me again say that whatever we discuss here in this lecture is by no means going to cover everything that may be said about Middle English. I will be just pointing to some important characteristics of Middle English and some important political events that led to the rise of Middle English, and ending with we are talking about the importance of writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, for instance. Okay, so this really is, let me warn you, rather elementary in in content, but this is just an introduction, okay, to a phase of in the history of the English language, namely Middle English, right. So, as with the previous lecture, A.C. Baugh's book, A History of the English Language, features prominently in as a source text for my lecture. So does Charles Barber's The English Language, a Historical Introduction, published by Cambridge University Press, and Indrani Ghosh's edited volume History of English Language, a Critical Companion. Okay. Now, in talking about the Middle English period, okay, this is one of the I would say the rare times really when we can pinpoint a certain date. Okay, we can look at a certain date as far as the beginning, okay, or how an event can really change the trajectory of a nation, can change the trajectory of the development of the language of a nation. Okay, Middle English is generally here, it's really not, it's not really one long homogeneous period. You have early Middle English, you have late Middle English, but this lecture being an elementary one, what I have done is simply refer to Middle English as one of the important periods of the English language, in the history of the English language, and I have gone by the usually accepted dates of 1150 to 1500. It is a long period of time, if you notice, 1150 to 1500. Okay. So, well, sorry. Okay. I had said just a while ago that one can at times, when one is speaking about the history of a nation or the history of the development of a language, though rarely one can point to a specific date or a specific event that holds tremendous influence or is really the core starting point when we begin to talk about a certain period, right. And in that there are many scholars who in fact say that if you are to point to the single most important event in this discourse, then that would be 1066. Okay, let us look at this here please. 1066 is the date when William, who was the Duke of Normandy, right. The Duke of Normandy. Normandy is a place in it is a part of modern France, and William was then the Duke of Normandy. In fact, the people in that part of France preferred to call themselves the Normans. Okay, the historians say that they were part of an earlier Scandinavian intrusion, if I may use the word, intrusion into France, right, and people in that area chose to call themselves the Normans, right. So, in 1066, right, there was the important event known as the Battle of Hastings. Okay, when William, the Duke of Normandy, became King William I of England. Okay, so this is known as the Norman conquest of England, and this is extremely important to us because it brings in in a very important way the French element into not only the language, but also into various aspects of even the culture of Britain. It was a time when French language and culture held tremendous political power in the lives of the people. And most of this lecture here today would take off from this important event, that is 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and the conquest by King William, who went on to become King William, the erstwhile Duke of Normandy. So, we are now, and that is why we call this a separate phase, a very important separate phase called the Middle English phase of the one reason why we divide Middle English into two phases, Middle English into early Middle English, and late Middle English, is because of this event, the beginning, the Battle of Hastings and the subsequent very let's say a very rapid growth of prestige of the French language, and for late Middle English is really something else. It was the growth of nationalist feeling, etc., which we will talk about later, and ending with Geoffrey Chaucer and the rise of really a national language. Okay. So, in the early period, however, it so happened that once the French began to have political power, what happens is French becomes the language of the royal court. Language of the royal court. Right. Now, once it becomes the language of the royal court, it is quickly taken up by the three most important and apart from the royalty, the important sections. For instance, this would be the time when there would be a sort of the first beginnings of class as far as language was concerned. Many scholars are of the opinion that Old English did not have, at least as compared to Middle English, the division of language on language based on class. I mean, there was a marked, a very discernible division of the people, of the populace of Britain based on class. For instance, we would it's quite logical for us to to imagine that the business class, the business class would want to learn the French language. Why? Because French was, as we know, the language of the royal courts, and because of the need to be connected to to the royal courts, to, for instance, to people in to the ministers, to the royalty, to people in power, it was important for the business class to learn French. So, basically you have the ruling class and the business class speaking French, and what happens to English? English is then spoken by a class which begins to be recognized as a lower class. So, you have the upper classes speaking the powerful classes and the rich classes speaking French, and English being spoken by the lower classes. This is, again, let us remember, this is far more pronounced with the beginning of the Middle Age, of Middle English than it was before, if at all it was there before. The next important point that is related to this division of classes on the basis of language is another phenomenon. The phenomenon of, now you have to realize that there are two languages side by side. One was the Old English, Old English, that was extant during the time of when William of Normandy finally became King William of Britain, and the Old English was used by, as we know, the so called common people, the common populace, right, and also the nobility, and the people in power. Now, what happens is, we know that in Middle English, French becomes the language of power and pelf, right. Obviously, Old English is or English is not replaced by French altogether. So, we would have the phenomenon of people using two languages, and of two languages running side by side, though in different class or different stratifications of class. Okay. So, this was an important phenomenon, which is A, of course, we found is a replacement of the existing language by a foreign language, that is French, okay, and B, the simultaneous use, if not by the same person, however, the simultaneous use of two languages. And really, the Middle English period could also could be viewed in two ways. You can view it as the the acculturation of French and English, and you could also view it as a constant contest, okay, with sometimes in the earlier period at least the French language being dominant, and towards the end of the Middle English period the attempts at kind of reviving English or having English as one's national language. Okay. So, you had the juxtaposition of two languages during this time. Okay. So, fine. The Middle English dialects, many scholars say there are 5 dialects and some scholars say there are 4 dialects, but at least the important dialects were the Northern dialect, the Northern dialect, the East Midland dialect, the West Midland dialect and the Southern dialects. Okay. You remember that the Northumbrian, Mercian, etc., were the dialects that were the chief dialects in the time of Old English. Okay. So, here in Middle English the dialects are Northern, East Midland, West Midland and the Southern dialects. So, let us read then from Barbour, from Charles Barbour, whose text is one of our source texts here. He says, Barbour says, Old English did not disappear overnight. Okay, this is a point which I had mentioned just a while ago. Old English did not disappear overnight at the Norman conquest, nor did it immediately stop being written. Okay. Obviously, it's common sense to think that a language will not disappear just because power has been taken over by somebody else. So, Old English did not disappear overnight at the Norman conquest, nor did it immediately stop being written. For the West Saxon literary tradition was continued for a long time in some of the great monasteries, right. So, the West Saxon dialect of Old English was alive and it was maintained, sustained by the great monasteries, even though elsewhere as far as business was concerned, as far as power was concerned, the court was concerned, the language may have been French. Okay. So, we are not to think in an erroneous way that with the coming in of the Duke of Normandy as King William and along with him so many are from the French nobility, it does not mean that Old English disappeared. It is for simply for convenience which is one of the hazards of really dividing time according historical time into different periods. So, these are some of the hazards that we have to bear in mind. Okay. Therefore, Old English did not disappear overnight at the Norman conquest, nor did it immediately stop being written, nor for the West Saxon literary tradition was continued for a time in some of the great monasteries. But in the years following the conquest, changes which had already begun to show themselves and in less than a century, we can say, this is important, in less than a century, it did not even take 100 years for the Old English period to be declared over and for the Middle English period to have considered to have begun. Okay. So, further also scholars call this a period of great change. Okay. For instance, there were more extensive and fundamental changes because of the Norman conquest and the conditions that followed. More about this in a while. Continuation of tendencies that had begun to manifest themselves in the earlier period in Old English, and changes that affected the grammar and the vocabulary of the English language. This being most important, at least for our lecture here. Okay, and I am going to spend some time speaking about the changes particularly in vocabulary with the coming in of the French language. For about close to 200 years, okay, but close to 200 years, we see this, we see that the language of the people, the language of the common people, so to speak, remained English. Okay. Though there were attempts, okay, at at a certain fusion, right. English at that time was not exactly a language that was despised by the French. Okay. There were elements of some sort of acculturation, as I said, between French and English. And for instance, the merchant class, okay, merchants would speak both English, okay, and French, right. And this continued for continued for quite some time till the conscious development of nationalist feelings, which again happened because of political reasons, and which I am going to talk about in a while. Okay. Now, as I said, we are going to talk about, and let us look at this page here, we are going to talk about the influence of vocabulary, okay, the coming, and it is very interesting to notice the patterns. For instance, if you know, if I asked you, if you knew that French was the language of the court, okay, French was the language being learned by the business class, then what kind of words are going to be borrowed? Okay, we know a lot of borrowing from the French language. So, what kind of words are going to be borrowed and made part of the English language? Many of those words remain with us today. So, now in this list, let us look at the words that are going to come in with what we call the French impact on the vocabulary. Okay. Now, for instance, the church, right, the church being the third component of power. For instance, you have said we talked about political power, okay, we talked about business power, and the third is the church, and apparently the largest number of words, okay, that came in during this period were from the church. And for instance, ecclesiastical words, right, like religion, okay, prayer, words of vocation like pastor, okay, then chaplain, right. These are some of the words that as you see has become part of the modern English vocabulary. It has stayed with us, and also in the church, for instance, things that are associated, right. For here, for instance, you have words that have come in based on vocation, okay, or you could say based on status regarding to vocation in the church. And we also or say general words like prayer, we also have words that are associated, let us see here, words that are associated with the service, church service. Okay. The words that are associated were borrowed from French and associated with church service are, for instance, incense, lectern. Now, it is from this religious, religious background that today we use the word lectern also in academia. For instance, when a person gives a lecture, right, from a podium, we also refer to it as a lectern. Then abbey, okay, convent. Okay. These are some of the words that are to do with service, okay, with church service. Then the next important domain is in the domain of law, right. Obviously, now with the coming of the Normans with the Duke of Normandy, you would have a number of words that are borrowed from the French language into the legal into legalese, or the language that we use in the legal system. And now let us look at some of the words here, and these are crime, arrest, depose, innocent, decree, felon, from which we have felony, okay, proof, complaint, fine. All these words you will realize are important words even in legal, the legal language used even in our country. Okay. So, these are words that were borrowed from the French with the coming in of the Normans. Next, we can look at, say, words to do with culture and cultural artifacts. Music, image, prose, romance, okay, tragedy, palace, paper, pen. Okay. So, this is another domain in which we find a number of borrowings from the French language. Further, we will also talk about fashion, okay, fashion or social artifacts, right, social artifacts, apparel, embroidery, emerald, sapphire, right. These are some of the words that come from the word dress, for instance. Okay. These are words that belong to the domain of fashion. Next, food. There are several food words in the vocabulary that were borrowed from French, and among these are appetite, sugar, trickle, blanch, mince, gravy, etc. Okay. Now, when we look at these borrowings, when you look at the number of French words that have been, what are other domains that we looked at? We looked at culture and intellectual production, we looked at food, we looked at fashion, we looked at dress, we looked at law, for instance. Okay. And for a person who knows this for the first time, and he would find, or she would find it tremendously, interesting that so many of the words that we call English words, appetite, trickle, or the words in law, for instance, church words, for instance, laws of government. Okay, that is something that I missed out, and we will talk about that in a while. Words of government, for instance, all these words are words that were actually not English. These are words that have been borrowed from French following following the Norman conquest, right. So, next if we look at grammar, right, the most important points that are to be noted here is that in English grammar, the changes were mostly general reduction, or the general reduction of inflections or endings, right. Let us read from here. In English grammar, the changes were mostly general reduction of inflections, endings of the noun, adjective, and to some extent verb, okay, of the verb were altered in pronunciation in a way that these almost lost their distinctive form and hence their usefulness. The grammar of the English language was reduced from a high, this is most important, the grammar of the English language following the Norman conquest was reduced from a highly inflected language to an extreme, almost extremely analytical one. When you compare the scripts of Old English and Middle English, this is one of the first things that's going to strike you, and as I said, go to look it up in Google Images, look it up in YouTube, and you will find that one of the first things that strikes you is that there is a certain leveling, okay, there is a certain leveling out, and it removes, okay, or it does away with the inflectional system. So, as a result of this, what happens is prepositions become very important. Okay? Prepositions become important, word order becomes important, and there is a replacement of grammatical gender with natural gender. We looked at gender just a while ago. Strong verbs become regularized, right, and the strong weak adjective disappears as a result of the loss of inflectional endings. This image here shows you how there was the loss of inflections, okay, and here you will find there was reduction of these endings a, u, e and to a uniform e, right. So, it is perhaps from this period, from Middle English, that the characteristic of English as being, remember, I think we will be talking about this in one of the lectures, is the simplicity of the language. Okay. So, we may even use a word from agriculture and gardening here, which is pruning, okay, pruning of the inflectional endings and reducing it to simplicity. Okay. This is one of the most important characteristics of change from Old English to Middle English. Okay. Now, Baugh, A.C. Baugh, whose text, A History of the English Language, is a seminal text here. It was published long ago, but still remains one of the most important words here. Okay. He says that in early Middle English, only two methods of indicating the plural remained fairly distinctive. The ending s or es from the strong declension and the en from the weak. By 1200 and the early 1250s, the ending s was accepted as the standard plural ending in the North and the Midlands, and by the 14th century, it had become the normal sign of the plural in English nouns. Okay. So, with the loss of other inflections, finally, things were streamlined. For instance, the s ending for plural is one of the most common and one of the most important replacements of other inflections, right. Also, for instance, here you will see the adjective also getting the e ending from their previous forms. Also with the pronoun, you just skip this here, the verb. Now, Baugh further says that with the disappearance of grammatical gender, the idea of sex became the only factor in determining the gender of English nouns. If you recall, because of the ending in woman, in Whiffman, because the ending was masculine, it was considered masculine, but now in with the disappearance of grammatical gender, now comes in the idea of sex as the only factor in determining the gender of English nouns, where woman becomes feminine, right, not masculine as it was in Old English. So, Baugh says further, by making English the language mainly of uneducated people, the Norman conquest made it easier for grammatical changes to go forward unchecked. This is also an important aspect. Now, we talked a while ago on the French influence on the vocabulary, and we would look here at what Baugh has to say, okay, his comments on French influence on the vocabulary. English presented an inferior culture, and this was one of the factors involved for the influence of French words upon the English language. Okay. Why was English considered an inferior culture? Why? Because the culture of royalty, the culture of business, and eventually the culture of the church began to be dominated by French culture, which led on to the ready acceptance of words borrowed from the French language. Okay. So, we saw a while ago that English was used by the so called common man, okay, while the French language, people were for reasons of social climbing, people would learn French, and particularly people who were moving from the say the lower middle classes to to the merchant business class, okay, who had to sort of who had to hobnob, so to speak, with people in the court, the church, and the royalty, had to learn the French language, right. So, in English, as Baugh says, represented an inferior culture, and this was one of the factors involved for the influence of French words upon the English language. And he says, a stream of French words poured into English with a momentum that continued until toward the end of the Middle English period, right. He too is making this difference between early Middle English and later Middle English. Now, a stream of French words excuse me, poured into English with a momentum that continued until toward the end of the Middle English period. In this movement, two stages can be observed, an earlier and a later, with the year 1250 as the approximate dividing line. And we shall see in a while why particularly early 13th century was an important watershed, okay, dividing line between early modern Middle English and later or late Middle English. So, earlier borrowings, that is, Baugh says, prior to 1250 were words like baron, noble, dame, servant, messenger, and usually scholars agree that the number is roughly around 900, and later borrowings were borrowings that were governmental and administrative, ecclesiastical, legal, military, and familiar, words of fashion, belonging to the realm of fashion, food, art, learning, and medicine. This is something we have seen earlier. This is important. Why? Because these are markers of class division. Okay? Look at a word like servant, right, as compared to noble or baron, right. Look at the word messenger. Okay. These are words that are indicative of class division, and as I said, it is to Middle English that we have to look if we really have to look at the beginnings, or at least part of the beginnings of the class system in Britain. So, what are these governmental and administrative words? This is something that I left out. We talked about ecclesiastical, food, fashion, etc. The governmental and administrative words are the word government itself, governor, administer, crown, state, empire, subject, rebel, tax, alliance, prince, princess, duke, minister, noble, manners, slave, servant, peasant, etc. So, these are now for a person studying this from a political angle would find this a most interesting data. Okay. Again, as I said, the division of the people into slave, servant, peasant, words like manner, and it is said that many of so these were some of the words that were borrowed from the French language, and you find this really infused into so many different domains. I would like to quickly end by talking about the rise of standard English, and this again happened with the loss of Normandy, the loss of Normandy, which led to interestingly the re-establishment of English. Okay. In around 1204 or 5, Normandy was lost by the royalty in Britain, and with the loss of Normandy came about subsequently a feeling of nationalism. Okay. Events like the loss of holdings, right, which we find happen in by the end of the 13th century in England, would lead to the gradual loss of prestige of a language, right. Then there are many other reasons why finally a person like Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, could determine the growth, growth and establishment of a kind of language, of a kind of English, which was known as the national language. Okay. More about this in Professor Borra's lecture on the age of Chaucer, and finally, we will end with the importance of London English. By far, as mentioned by Baugh, by far the most influential factor in the rise of standard English was the importance as London as the capital of England. London English took as well as gave. It began as a southern and ended as a Midland dialect. The London standard had been accepted in most parts of the country in writing in the latter part of the 15th century. So, by the time just before Shakespeare, okay, we already have a language in place, right, with a standardized dialect, okay, which enabled the flowering of the English language, so to speak, in the hands of great writers like Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson, like Christopher Marlowe, for instance. Okay. The background to the flowering of that language is this, the late Middle English, the growth of nationalist feeling, okay, if you may call it the separation of the English nobility from the French nobility around 1204 5, okay, and by 1250 really, as I said, French being almost regarded as a foreign language, a language that was so important, now regarded as a foreign language. This is the historical background to the great works, and the person who is who figures most prominently here is Geoffrey Chaucer, and you are aware of the famous Canterbury Tales. These are the works that finally went on to bring back the English language. Okay. However, it was sort of already infused with French vocabulary, and however, its earlier inflectional system being diminished a lot. This is the new language, so to speak, or the standardized London standard of language that was established and forms a backdrop to the next age, which is modern English, right. So, we end here today, and one of the most important things which important questions which may be posed here is about the Battle of Hastings and the coming the Norman conquest, and what happened with the coming of the Norman French, right. What changes happen, and you should always mention the importance of the class factor, okay, that even as far as language is concerned, we find new terms being borrowed from the French, okay, terms that are indicators of class status, the terms like noble, for instance, like servant, like peasant. Okay. Apart from that, you may want to learn up some of the words that came. So, if you get a, came with the Norman conquest, for instance, if you get a question like the Norman conquest led to the borrowing of several words from French, okay, in various domains. So, name those domains and give examples of those words. Then you would talk about important domains like government and administrative domain, like ecclesiastical domain of the church, okay. Then of the business class, right. Then terms leading to cultural life in general, for instance, fashion, food, right. Terms leading to, again as I said, class. So, these are some of the domains that you can build up like an inventory and learn up the respective words that fall into these, okay, and show how all these. Law was another important thing, domain that we talked about, and show how these words continue to be some of the most important words. Okay. So, how do you have words in law without using the word crime, for instance, without using the word plaintiff, for instance, or complaint or complainant, for instance. Okay. So, that English by now is truly language that is what linguists call a borrowing language. By now, it was it's a language which is borrowed heavily from the French language, okay. And the Middle English period, now remember we are talking at an elementary level. The Middle English period is largely the tale or story of two things, okay. One is the Norman conquest, okay, and the importance and prestige of French language, French culture, okay. Second part is the diminished prestige of French with the coming in of the spirit of French English nationalism, okay, following the loss of Normandy by the royalty in Britain, okay, with I also forgot to mention the Black Death, okay, which led to the death of many people in Britain, and with the labor class, the working force becoming important because of the lack of the paucity of labor, okay. And what kind of words were, what language was used by the working class? The language used was English, okay. So, again now more than the business class, you have, following the Black Death, the language of the working class being important, okay. And finally, the establishment of a standard London dialect, finally to Geoffrey Chaucer, and through literature the final establishment and re-instantiation of the English language, okay. So, let us end here. In the next language lecture, we shall be talking about early modern English. Thank you.